As our son Ethan hurried through breakfast, the quiet hum of Nathan's electric razor from the bathroom blended with the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. I stood by the window, holding a cup of coffee, and stared out into the backyard, feeling the weight of my own stillness. I told myself that this wasn't supposed to feel like this. It was a phase, a byproduct of 17 years of marriage and the daily grind of life. Our relationship had always been a quiet, steady flame in our 20s, not the sweeping, romantic kind of love that people wrote about, but the dependable warmth that makes a house a home. But lately that warmth felt dim. Nathan came out of the bathroom, dressed for work, his tie immaculate, and he nodded as usual. He looked at me with a slight smile, saying, "Bust a day today." His tone was casual and distant, as is customary when we meet. I answered, mirroring his simplicity, and he didn't press further. He hardly ever does these days, and I lingered at the window as he left for the office. The office was bustling with its usual chaos, phones ringing, conversations humming, the distant tapping of phones, and the empty space he'd left behind. Ethan had already vanished upstairs, likely absorbed in his devices, and the house was silent once more. This kind of silence wasn't peaceful, but suffocating work had always been my escape at the firm. I wasn't a wife or mother, I was just Mia, a competent project manager with a knack for making things happen. It gave me a sense of identity that I sometimes struggled to find at home. I had become accustomed to the rhythm of keyboards, which was safe and predictable, but on this particular day, it was disturbed. "Good morning," Eric said as he passed my desk. His voice was commanding, and his presence was commanding. Eric was my boss, but he rarely seemed like one. He had a way of making everyone feel at ease, and I returned his greeting with a courteous smile, but it lasted longer than I had intended. There was something about Eric's easy confidence and the way he seemed genuinely interested in people that had always fascinated me, but curiosity was harmless, wasn't it? The first time he lingered at my desk after a meeting, we were brainstorming solutions for a difficult project, and I valued his collaborative approach. However, as the weeks passed, our conversations started to veer off topic, first to personal interests, then to shared frustrations, and finally to dreams that had long since been buried under the weight of adulthood. It was late in the evening, after the office had cleared out, that his vulnerability and his tone disarmed me for a moment when he asked, "Mia, do you ever feel stuck?" I wasn't sure if I should lower my guard or not, but something about the quiet sincerity of the moment made me answer honestly at times. "It's like I'm moving through life on autopilot, and I don't know how to switch back to manual," I said, and his eyes softened. He nodded as if he understood completely. I believe that many people feel that way. We just don't talk about it. We didn't talk much after that. On the surface, though, everything felt normal when I left the office and went home. Nathan asked me about my day, and I smiled and nodded at the appropriate times as he told me about his new gadget. Later that night, as Nathan slept next to me, I stared at the ceiling, replaying Eric's question in my head. "Do you ever feel stuck?" I wanted to brush it off as a fleeting thought, a brief moment of connection between two coworkers. The days following that first late-night conversation with Eric went by in a blur, but something had changed. At first glance, everything was the same: meetings, deadlines, family dinners, and so on, but I felt lighter, as if a door had opened that I hadn't noticed before, and now I couldn't unsee it. Eric's attention seemed professional at first, but something about it had struck a chord as I fell into a restless sleep, making me wonder if there was a way to feel unstuck again, or if I even deserved to. He said, "You handled that presentation brilliantly," once after I managed to pull off a last-minute proposal for a challenging client. His voice carried an edge of admiration that made me pause. At first, it was nothing unusual, a colleague checking in to offer support brainstorming ideas for a difficult project. However, the details were different, including an extra beat of eye contact during a team meeting and the way he lingered after everyone else had left compliments that felt less forced and more deliberate. When I walked past his office one morning wearing a dress I had bought on a whim, Nathan didn't even notice. I smiled politely, brushing it off. But lady, that day as I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I found myself turning his words over in my head. The office emptied earlier than usual one evening, leaving just a few stragglers finishing up. I said this in a casual tone, but my stomach fluttered unexpectedly. Then there were the times when he seemed to notice things about me that no one else did. Green suits you. I was finishing up emails when Eric's voice startled me. Burning the midnight oil once more, Mia. I looked up to see him leaning against the doorframe of his office, his tie loose, his sleeves rolled up, a rare sight for someone who is always perfectly put together. Someone needs to keep the lights on. I half joked, and he laughed, gesturing toward his office. I was about to open a bottle of wine to celebrate making it through this week. Would you mind joining me? His offer seemed innocuous at first glance, but something about his tone. He added wine, sensing my paw, and reassured me that there was no pressure. Before I could overthink it, I found myself following him into his office. The room felt different at night, quieter, and he poured 2 glasses of wine, handed me one, and then motioned for me to sit on the couch to survive the chaos. I echoed his words, raising his glass to survival, and grinned faintly as our glasses clinked at first. Comfortably in the world of work, challenging clients, impending deadlines, and the typical office grousing, but as the minutes went by, things started to change. He asked me questions about myself as a person and as a colleague. What did you want to be when you were a kid? His tone was inquisitive, almost playful, and the question caught me off guard because I hadn't considered it in years. I replied, an artist, which surprised even me. His eyebrows raised in genuine interest, and I confessed that I used to spend hours with a sketch pad. Dreaming about going to Paris and studying at the Art Me there, his eyes softened, and I said, "What stopped you from living?" With a shrug and a smile that was tinged with regret, responsibilities, and practicality. He didn't say anything, but he watched me intensely for a moment, making me feel vulnerable but also seen in a way that I had years to go. He said, "Finally, to Paris," and I laughed lightly, shaking my head. His tone was serious, and his words hung in the air between us. He was leaning slowly and deliberately, giving me every opportunity to pull away, but I didn't. When his lips met mine, it was like a shock of electricity that ran through me. It wasn't just the kiss itself, it was the feelings it evoked, the excitement connection, the spark of something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about passion or lust. The kiss happened so quickly and unexpectedly that I didn't have time to process it until it was over. "I'm sorry," he said softly, though his eyes told a different story. "I should go," I whispered, my voice shaky as I stood. He didn't stop me as I left his office and walked into the empty parking lot. My heart pounded in my chest, the taste of the kiss still lingering on my lips, and guilt bubbled up, but it was overtaken by something far more dangerous, a desire to feel that way. When he pulled back his expression, it was unreadable, a mixture of vulnerability and quiet confidence. Eric didn't mention the kiss when I saw him at work the following morning. He greeted me with his typical warm smile, professional but tinged with familiarity, as though nothing had happened. I was both grateful and disappointed at the same time. In the days after that kiss, I told myself it was a mistake, a line crossed in a brief moment of weakness. I promised myself it wouldn't happen again, that I would refocus on my marriage, my family, and my life, but I learned that promises are brittle things when desire starts to take root. Another part of me, once steeped in guilt and self-recrimination, was relieved by his silence, but something had changed. It began small, with Eric staying at my desk a little longer after meetings. His presence was magnetic in a way that made the air feel charged. He would find reasons to stop by, ostensibly to discuss work, but our conversations would always veer into the personal. One afternoon, he said, "I found this article on Paris." The first time we stayed late after work, it was under the pretense of an impending deadline. "I thought you might like it, so I put a printed page on my desk and looked down at the article, which was a travel guide to hidden art galleries in the city. My heart sank as I looked up at him and said, "Thank you," in a softer voice than I had intended. His eyes held mine, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "It's nothing," he replied, but the weight of his gaze told a different story. As the majority of our coworkers were wrapping up for the day, I hesitated because Nathan had been trying lately to organize a family dinner that night, which was a rare gesture I didn't want to dismiss. However, as Eric looked at me with an open and inviting expression, I found myself nodding yes, and I grabbed my laptop in his office. The hours passed without anyone noticing as we worked side by side, reviewing spreadsheets, debating strategies, and fine-tuning the proposal's details. But eventually the conversation changed, and I must say Eric said leaning. He sat back in his chair and said, "You've made my life so much easier since you joined the team." I chuckled and shook my head, but I think you're giving me too much credit. He was serious. His tone was earnest, and his praise made my cheeks flush. I looked down, fiddling with the edge of my notebook, and I said, "Thank you." His voice became softer, and when I looked up, his eyes were on mine, and the room felt suddenly very special. As the weeks passed, our late-night meetings increased in frequency, and we always had an excuse: a project deadline, a challenging client, a brainstorming session, but we both knew it wasn't just about work. Eric's charm was captivating, his confidence intoxicating, and he had a way of making me feel like the most important person in the room, as if my thoughts and opinions mattered in a way they hadn't in years. I wanted to say yes so that he could pull me back into the orbit of our marriage, but the idea of spending a weekend pretending everything was fine felt suffocating. I made excuses about work and Ethan's schedule, but Nathan's disappointment was obvious, and I hated myself for the lies and the growing distance I was creating between us. At home, Nathan was trying in his own quiet way. He noticed my distracted demeanor and suggested a weekend getaway, just the two of us. Eric and I were alone in his office one evening after another long day. The pretense of work had vanished, and we were once again in the comfortable rhythm of conversation. "What do you want, Mia?" he asked abruptly in a low, serious voice. "What do you mean in life?" he clarified. "What do you want? Not what you have to do, not what is expected of you." I stared at him, feeling the weight of the question bearing down on me. No one had asked me that in years. After I finally confessed, my voice was barely above a whisper, and Eric leaned forward, his eyes unblinking. "I think you do." His words hung in the air, daring me to face the truth I'd been avoiding, and before I could react, he reached out and touched me. The brief but electric contact sent a shiver down my spine, and the lines between us became increasingly hazy as each day went by. We stopped acting as though our relationship was solely professional, but we maintained This time, as the office lights went down and the outside world seemed to fade, Eric leaned in again, and I didn't hesitate. The kiss was slower and more deliberate, as if we were both enjoying the inevitable moment when we pulled apart. I felt breathless, my heart thumping in my chest, and I whispered, "We can't keep doing this," but my resolve was already eroding. Eric's lips curled into a small knowing smile, then told me. When Eric first mentioned Victor, we were wrapping up a routine meeting on a Tuesday afternoon. The conversation had turned into a thinly veiled excuse to spend time together, so as I was packing up to leave, Eric leaned back in his chair and said, "There's someone I think you should meet." I raised an eyebrow, and he smiled, that smile that always seemed to carry layers of meaning. "Victor is a brilliant guy from strategy, and I think you'd find him interesting." Lingered in my mind longer than it should have. I met Victor 2 days later in the break room. Eric introduced himself, placing his hand lightly on my shoulder as he said, "This is Victor." Mia looked up from his coffee cup, his dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that surprised me. Victor wasn't like Eric, who was open and charming. Instead, he was reserved, his demeanor cool and deliberate. "It's nice to meet you," I said, offering a polite smile. Eric responded in a smooth and measured voice. Eric had a way of arranging things to bring people together in subtle, almost imperceptible ways, and before I knew it, the three of us were spending more time together. At first, it was under the guise of collaboration, and Eric would suggest working sessions that conveniently included Victor, framing them as opportunities to engage in conversation. He did this with a faint smirk, as if he already knew something I couldn't see yet. Bring new perspectives to the table, but the dynamic was different. Victor's energy was more like gravity, steady and unavoidable. Victor didn't talk much, but when he did, his words were powerful. He had a keen mind that demanded attention, and I was drawn to his quiet confidence. One evening, after a lengthy meeting that had turned into casual conversation, the three of us lingered in Eric's office. I said, I could use a drink, and he stood up to come get a bottle of. Victor's gaze rested on me more than once, his dark eyes searching as though he was peeling back layers I wasn't sure I wanted exposed. And Eric noticed. He always noticed Eric was the one who planted the seed, you know. Victor nodded, and I hesitated only a moment before agreeing. The atmosphere changed as the bourbon flowed, and the conversation shifted from work to life, drifting into the kind of territory that felt both intimate and dangerous. You and Victor seem like an intriguing couple. I looked at him, taken aback, and asked, What do you mean? He shrugged, his smile mysterious, but it wasn't just an observation. It was a suggestion, a purposeful prod in a direction I hadn't thought of. Victor and I started spending more time together away from Eric's influence, starting with coffee breaks that went longer than they should have, and conversations that veered into very personal territory. He was completely different from Eric, and I found that contrast fascinating. The first time Victor kissed me, it was after a late-night brainstorming session. Victor was all easy charm and calculated confidence.
He was raw and unfiltered.
He challenged me in ways that were both thrilling and unsettling, forcing me to confront parts of myself that I had long buried. You're not happy, he said bluntly one afternoon, his gaze fixed on me. The directness of his statement made my breath catch. What makes you say that? He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I don't have a response. When he turned to face me, his expression was unreadable. I can't stop thinking about you, he said softly, and my heart pounded in my chest as I searched his face, unsure of what to say. Before I could reply, he leaned in and brushed my lips in a slow, deliberate kiss that left no room for doubt. When he pulled back, I felt breathless from the weight of the moment. Eric had left the session hours earlier, leaving the two of us alone in the quiet hum of the office. We were sitting side by side, papers spread out between us. The words felt hollow as I whispered them, but Victor didn't argue. He didn't need to, and the look in his eyes told me that he knew it wasn't the end. Eric noticed the change almost instantly, so he said, One evening, what do you think of Victor's? I wasn't sure how much to reveal, but he's interesting. Eric smiled, and Whidden had a knowing glint in his eye. I thought you might think so. As the weeks went by, the boundaries between the three of us became more hazy. Eric's charm, Victor's intensity, and my own conflicted desires created a dynamic that was both thrilling and terrifying. One evening, while we were sitting together in his apartment, sharing a bottle of wine, Eric made the unthinkable proposal. You don't have to choose, you know, he said in a low, deliberate voice. My breath caught as I looked at him, then at Victor, who was watching me with an unreadable expression. What are you saying? I asked, barely raising my voice above a whisper. The words hung in the air heavy with implication as I looked between the two of them, my heart thumping in my chest, and he leaned closer, his smile slow and deliberate. Maybe you don't have to choose at all, he said. The descent into betrayal wasn't abrupt. Rather, it was a series of moments, each small enough to justify the last building until there was no turning back after that first night at Eric's apartment. The kiss with Victor had been one thing, a risky, thrilling error. But what had happened next had crossed a line I couldn't even acknowledge existed. Nevertheless, the very next time Eric invited me to dinner, I accepted, and the three of us had developed an unspoken rhythm. Eric was the one who started things, constantly pushing boundaries with his effortless charm and playful provocations, while Victor was the firm presence, his quiet intensity grounding us even as it drew me deeper into his orbit, and I became. At first, we kept things casual, with drinks after work, dinners that lasted late into the night, and stolen moments that teetered on the edge of impropriety. However, every encounter felt like a test, every glance, every touch, and every dare to see how far we could go. That night at Eric's apartment, the air felt different. We had finished hours earlier, but none of us had moved to leave the room, which was filled with the low hum of music, the clink of glasses, and the undercurrent of I sat between them on Eric's huge couch, which was too small to ignore how close their bodies were to one another. Victor poured me another glass of wine, his hand brushing mine as he handed it to me. Seeing that Eric was watching us, his expression was unreadable, but he asked, "Are you nervous?" Eric's tone was light, but his eyes were sharp, and I blinked in surprise. "No, why would I be?" Victor smiled, leaning back against the couch. The way Victor's fingers lingered on his glass, the way Eric's leg brushed against mine, the charged silence that surrounded our words, and the way Eric made the first move he always did, turning to me, his smile softening as he leaned in the kiss, made me lose myself in the moment. I closed my eyes, lost myself in the taste of him, and felt the tension in the room grow with each second until it felt like a living thing pressing down on us. Victor leaned in and kissed me, but when he pulled away, my mind was racing and my body was shaking from the weight of what was happening. Eric broke the silence, whispering in a low, intimate voice, "You don't have to choose." I froze, my eyes darting between them, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Victor didn't say anything, but his expression was calm, almost expectant, as though he had been waiting for this moment. Eric repeated, "You don't have to choose." In that moment, I let go and kissed Eric first, my hands tangled in his hair as I pulled him closer. The kiss was urgent and reckless, full of all the things I couldn't say aloud. When I pulled away, I turned to Victor, my breath catching as our eyes met. His kiss was softer, slower, but no less intense. His hands rested on my waist, steadying me as I melted into him. And then there I crossed the line. I had been tiptoeing around for weeks, cheating on my husband. When I got home that night, Nathan was already asleep, so I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and stared at him as he lay there unaware of the storm I had unleashed. I couldn't answer because my mind was too clouded with guilt and excitement to form coherent thoughts. I should have felt shame, regret, or anything that would have made me stop, but all I felt was the overwhelming desire to do it all over again. I had always thought of betrayal as a single act, a clear line crossed, but the truth was far messier. It wasn't just about what happened in Eric's living room. It was about every text I sent, every excuse I gave Nathan, and every time I chose to stay late at work when I didn't have to. It was about the life I was still leading, the facade I was desperately trying to maintain, and the one I was recklessly building with Eric and Victor. The weeks following that night at Eric's apartment were a fog of stolen moments and quiet secrets. Victor was there as usual, his quiet presence grounding the electric energy that Eric always seemed to bring. After yet another secret meeting, we were sitting in his apartment with the city lights glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Before speaking, Eric swirled his glass of whiskey thoughtfully. "Have you ever thought about what it would be like to just leave?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His tone was serious, but his eyes were dancing with excitement. "Your job, this city you hold." His words hung in the air, intoxicating and impossible at first, and I dismissed the idea as fantasy, a fleeting daydream that would fade as quickly as it came. Life just started over, and I stared at him, not sure if I should laugh or take him seriously. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and said, "You're joking." Eric continued, his voice calmly and steadily, and his voice was soft but compelling.
Think about it, Mia.
No more pretending, no more obligations, just freedom. We'd be untethered, Eric said one night in a low, convincing voice. Victor nodded and added in his pragmatic tone, "It's not as far-fetched as it seems. People do it all the time. Reimagine yourself and walk away from what's holding you back." Eric was persistent, and Victor's quiet conviction made the impossible seem plausible. Their words started to take root, weaving themselves into the cracks of my discontent, and they painted a picture of a life free from the limitations that had burdened me for so long, with a life of adventure, passion, and a connection I never knew existed. Now, Eric said, his hand brushing mine, "Just think about it," and I did. The plan came together with such speed and accuracy that I was left speechless. Eric, with his innate charisma and leadership, handled the logistics, researching destinations, organizing travel, and mapping out a route that felt both exciting and terrifying. Victor Ever, the strategist, handled the financial details we'll need to liquidate assets, explaining his. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, Ethan was in his room, and for once it was just the two of us. "I've been busy," I said, voiding his gaze busy with what he pressed, his tone more curious than before. "This is the life you deserve," Eric told me, his voice full of quiet intensity, "not the half-life you're living." Nathan noticed the change in me, and he said, "You've been distracted lately." Because Nathan had always trusted me, the weight of my deceit became almost unbearable as the days turned into weeks. Eric secured plane tickets, booking them under false names. Victor arranged for a rental property in a remote location where we could disappear without a trace, and we'll leave at night, Eric said in a firm tone to minimize the chances of anyone noticing. I lied, and the word tasted bitter on my tongue. He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't push further. The night before we were scheduled to depart, I stood in my bedroom and stared at the suitcase I had packed in secret. Nathan was asleep, his breathing steady and peaceful, and I watched him for a long time, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. For the first few weeks, we had little communication, no phones, no emails, because we needed to establish distance. Their confidence was infectious, and their vision of a new life was intoxicating, and slowly I found myself agreeing to each small concession that pulled me further into their world. Victor didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. The guilt didn't just follow me around at night, it followed me everywhere. I would see mothers with their kids in town and get a pang so sharp it left me. "Slightly are you?" he asked in a soft but insistent voice. I hesitated, caught between their gazes, and finally said, "I'm just tired." Eric reached for my hand, his grip warm and reassuring. Breathless, I thought about Ethan all the time, his laugh, his endless curiosity, and the way he used to call me his partner in crime. I also thought about Nathan, the man I had spent 17 years building a life with, and despite all of our flaws and the ways we had drifted, he had been a good man, and I had betrayed him in the worst way possible. One afternoon, as I stood on the terrace watching the waves crash against the shore, Victor joined me. "You're not happy," he said in a quiet but firm voice, and I didn't respond. Instead, he pressed toward me, keeping my eyes focused on the horizon, Mia. The turning point came on a quiet evening, when Eric was out charming the local as usual and Victor was absorbed in his work. I sat alone in the living room staring at the phone I wasn't supposed to use, and before I knew it, I was dialing Nathan's number. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. Victor sighed and brushed his hand against mine. "You're still you. You just need time to adjust," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Heart thumping, I heard Nathan beep. I said, my voice shaking, "I don't know what to say. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please tell Ethan I love him." Before I could say anything more, I hung up the phone. Later that night, as I lay awake, I realized that the freedom Eric and Victor had promised me wasn't actually freedom at all, but rather a cage, a prison I had created for myself out of lies and selfish desires. I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to return, but as I gazed out at the endless horizon, I questioned whether I could bear the cost I had to pay.